Good evening, everybody. Thank you guys for coming tonight. My name is Tiffany Priestley, and I am the chair for the Park West School Division Board of Trustees. Tonight, we are gathered here to hear the 2021 proposed public budget meeting. I want to thank you all for coming, for taking time out of your evening to sit with us and see where next year's school year is going to go. From this point, I'm going to pass it on to Stephen, and we'll move on with our night. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Stephen David. I'm the superintendent, and myself and Darrell Fulton, the secretary-treasurer, will take you through the budget proposed for next year. How many people you have streaming online right now, Jason? Okay. So typically at this meeting, we give you a sense of what our plan is for the budget for next year. On January 30th, we got the provincial budget announcement, and that typically comes at the end of January. But we've been meeting as a board since the beginning of December, and our last budget meeting was just this past Thursday, February 20th. And at that time, we finalized what we hope will be the draft budget. Well, it is the draft budget for this year, but there's going to be opportunities not just tonight, but in the next 2 weeks for public consultation if any of you want to give feedback to what we're proposing. So the first slide, and I think they can see both me and the slide, Jason, is that correct? So the first slide just shows you our demographic information, our projected enrollment for next year, and our current enrollment. So if you look from one year to the other, the difference is 12.5 students. So our total enrollment in all of our schools, we're going to go up 12.5 students. And what we see often is those numbers balance out among our schools. Some schools gain a few, some schools go down a few, but this has been consistent for us certainly since 2012 when we began the partnership with Wayways-Capo. Our numbers have held steady, if not increased slightly every year. So unlike many school divisions, we have three main sources of income. First one is provincial government, which forms a sizable portion. We also have municipal levy, local taxation, and because over 25% of our students are First Nation, the vast majority of them are from Wayways-Capo. A large portion of our funding comes from our First Nation partner. And I'm not going to read every slide to you. This presentation will be posted tomorrow on our division website, so you'll have a chance to explore it further. And the one thing I should mention for anyone that's watching this, whether in the audience here or at home, if you have any questions, please email the division or give us a call, and we'll do our best to respond to them quickly. So we start with this every year in terms of framing the context for a budget. We speak to our budget challenges, but what I will say, and this is not insignificant, we've had several years, this is the fourth year I think, where our provincial funding is being reduced, multiple years for cap on our local taxation, and we've had some tough budgets in previous years. Notwithstanding the fact that we're still being reduced and we're still having a cap on that taxation, we likely started at a better place than we have in previous years. So prior to Christmas, we were contemplating options that might impact school staffing and other additional programs beyond what we've cut previously. And then early in January, things kind of looked a little bit more optimistic, and our general perspective as a board at that point was we're not going to cut anything we don't have to, nor would we add anything that wasn't necessary. And we've done some additional calculations, both in terms of our projections for next year, as well as our current status. And while we're not flush with cash by any means, it's definitely a better starting point that we've had in the past 3 years. So in terms of the key challenges, I've already referenced the first two. We have staffing costs every year. It's the nature of a business. 75 to 80% of a school division costs are staff related. This is the third year of the 4-year provincial sustainability, Bill 28. The 2 previous years, our staff on union contracts, either the EAs or non-teaching staff on CUPE or teachers, they had 0% wage increases for 2 consecutive years. And this year, all of those people get 0.75%. And the increment references those teachers that are in the first 10 years of their employ. That's the way it works. Your salary increases each year until you max out after 10 years. Maintaining our schools is also a challenge, or maybe I should say maintaining our infrastructure, whether it be the schools or the buses or any of the things that aren't human resource related. Most of our schools outside of Birtle Elementary were built in the late 60s, and they have lots of challenges in terms of the typical challenges that schools built of that era do. Flat roofs often require replacement, and boilers are old and aging and those kind of things. And as we hear very often and clearly from our transportation supervisor, we have an aging bus fleet with lots of miles on our buses. And sorry about that, I may not have been talking close enough to the microphone. Inflation is always a challenge. And the final thing, a new challenge for us this year, is the uncertainty regarding the education review. So if you're not aware of this, the provincial government over most of 2019 conducted a provincial education review, and they did lots of public consultations, and our board and divisional admin had a chance to present at one of those consultation sessions in Brandon. And as I understand it now, the provincial government has the recommendation from the review commission, and their commitment is to give us their plan for the future of education in Manitoba by the end of March. And I've heard from a couple of informed sources that we'll be finding out what that plan is on March 27th, which interestingly enough corresponds to the final Friday before spring break. So I've already referenced the key things in terms of the provincial direction, in terms of funding and taxation. The one additional thing that was a new wrinkle that was added on the January 30th announcement was a 15% management reduction. And this is a reduction that's happened in other public sectors. Provincial government did it a couple of years back. I understand that health was subjected to that as well. And essentially, in a nutshell, is they're requiring a 15% management reduction in terms of positions. Now, we've written a letter of appeal, I guess you could say, to the province. It's their feeling that we're compliant with this already for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we spend far below what is our provincial cap for administration. We are allowed, based upon our division size and other factors, to spend 3.38% of our budget on administration. We only spend 2.86%. And perhaps more significantly, if you remember from last year, one of the positions we cut last year was our assistant superintendent. So those are the positions that they're directing divisions to reduce, and just happened by our good fortune or misfortune that we chose to reduce that position last year. Now there's a July 1st, 2019 baseline, but the position in our division actually extended it to July 12th. So we're fairly confident that we're compliant, and we've had some conversations with people at the Department of Education just to affirm that perspective. So the additional revenue is a big one, and that kind of reflects what I mentioned earlier about how we're starting off in a better position this year than we had been previously. Typically, when we do budgeting or forecasting for First Nation enrollment numbers, we're a bit conservative. And basically what that means is because of fluctuations in student enrollment for First Nation students, for all students for that matter, we project lower than what our actual count might be for the next year. And that isn't a negative thing necessarily, and it's not about First Nation, non-First Nation, but what typically happens, our provincial funding is based upon September 30th of the previous year. So it's locked in. However, up until this year, federal funding for First Nation students is variable. And what that means is often they will do multiple counts to assess the number of students. So until this year, all of our First Nation students and Park West were counted twice. So we did a September 30th count, and then we did a later count in February. And if we lost students from those two time periods, we lost funding. Because the way it works with First Nation students, it's not a single grant as it is for provincial kids. Every student we gain is additional revenue, and every student we lose is less revenue. So the key thing that happened this year is we have a single billing pilot project that was approved by the federal government with our partner Wayway-Scapa. And what that does is it allows our students to be counted, and for Wayway students, a single time on September 30th. So that has had a huge impact. And also with that, as I mentioned previously, we were conservative in our budgeting, and I'll give you the specific example in a minute if we go to the next slide. So I apologize for those of you in the crowd. I find I'm consciously looking at the camera, but I'll try to look at the people, and especially the trustees, so nobody tells me I've avoided eye contact. So they're the graphs that show our First Nation enrollments over the past few years, and the blue is projected enrollment and red is actual. So if you look at the 3 years preceding this year, our projections were consistently higher than what we realized. So we asked principals and we looked at enrollment projections and we picked our number for First Nation students, but we didn't realize that number. So for 19 and 20, there's a huge gap. There's 30 more students that we've realized than what we projected. And the way that worked, this is referencing high school students. The count for Wayway-Sakapo students is separate. And I apologize, I didn't mention this at the beginning. We have a partnership with Wayway-Sakapo. Our total divisional budget is about $30 million, but this presentation tonight is focusing on the provincial portion, so the non-Wayway-Sakapo portion. So essentially, they are part of our division and their budget is part of our budget, but their budget process is separate from our process. So they will work on their budget, they will put it forward, it'll be a balanced budget, and it'll go within our budget. So roughly I'm talking about 24 million in terms of the provincial side. So if you look at 19 and 20, our high school principals told us that we were expecting 155 First Nation students in total in high school. To be conservative, we budgeted for 138, 17 below the projection, but based upon the previous 3 years, we thought that was a reasonable estimate and would allow us a bit of a buffer to ensure that we didn't lose students, nor did we lose funding. Secondary to that is back to the single billing. So the single billing was only approved in October of this year, and it locked in the funding for Wayway-Sakapo students in September. Consequently, it has a huge impact on our divisional budget. So just for those 30 students that are represented there by the difference between 138 and 168, that's $12,600 per student. It's about $330,000 in additional revenue for a division this year that we didn't plan for. So that has been a very good thing, both in terms of where we are currently, but it also projects forward because right now we have 168 First Nation students. We're projecting 165 for next year. So I can tell you that we have a 175 in total that the principals are telling us, and we're still allowing a little bit of a buffer of 10. And the other caution, I guess, and it's important for the board, the single billing that I've referenced a couple of times, it's only a pilot for this year. It's certainly our hope that it continues in September, but there's no guarantee, so we wanted to build it in a little buffer again. You can go to the next one, Joe. This is an important slide because it references the fact that while our funding has decreased, our total funding, our costs continue to go up. So staffing costs continue to go up, and as do infrastructure needs. But if you look at this graph, the green represents staffing, salaries and benefits, and the blue represents service and supplies. So what I can tell you is as our budget shrinks, but our staffing costs increase, that allows us less money for other things. And that's part of the challenge in terms of infrastructure. So it's a very simple exercise. We have a grade 8 student, I think, visiting us tonight in the audience. To give you a simple example, if we have $100 to spend each year, in any given year maybe we spend $75 on staffing, but now we had, instead of $75 out of 100, this year we're spending $77 out of 98. So our total fund or total revenue is shrinking, but our costs still go up. And that puts pressure on maintenance and transportation and all those other things that are not associated with staffing costs. So I don't want to spend too much time on these next few slides for a couple of reasons. There's 5 slides that show the things that we've cut in the last 3 years. We've had some very challenging budgets. So we've cut programs, we've cut staffing, we've cut services, we've cut all kinds of things with one exception. We've had very little impact on school-based staffing despite all the budget challenges that we've had over the last 4 years. In fact, even before we knew how this budget would start off, one of our preliminary tenets, one of our basic things that we committed to is the last resort will be affecting school staffing. So I'm pleased to say that because of various reasons, including the additional revenue that I've already referenced, there's no impact on school staffing. In fact, we have not had the need to reduce any staff in the division. We're still waiting for the province's final say on the management reduction, but we haven't had to do anything like that. We've made some small additions, which I'll note in a few minutes, but we haven't had to make any significant reductions. So what I would say is I've already referenced the fact that this will be on our divisional website tomorrow. There's 5 pages of reductions that you can revisit. Almost none of those things are coming back. So it's not like we're flush with money, as I referenced at the beginning. There are a couple of little things, very small things totaling about $6,000 that we've reintroduced that were taken away. But the reality, the unfortunate reality is if we reduce things over the past 3 years or the previous 3 years, we're not returning them in 2021. This year, because of the increased First Nation enrollment, and assuming that all of our budgets are spent 100%, we're projecting about $470,000 surplus just for 19 and 20. However, at the beginning of this year, we actually had an operating surplus of negative 70,000 or negative 73,000, something in that range. So we are projecting for the end of the school year an accumulated surplus of 400,000. It may seem like a lot, but on a $30 million budget or on a $25 million budget on the provincial side, it really represents about 2% of our total budget. And the province allows us to retain a surplus up to 4%. So this is a good thing, but we've also seen in the past 3 or 4 years when there's unexpected budget pressures, you need money in the surplus. And it also reflects the fact that we've done some good budgeting as a board and a division in the last couple of years. For example, we had a run on maternity leave for several years that exceeded our budget every year. And finally last year, instead of operating in a deficit position, the board chose, and a very good decision, added $105,000 to that budget line. So this year, barring any additional maternity leaves for the remainder of the year, we should be fine with maternity leaves. The one interesting thing to note with mat leaves is the full mat leave, the cost of it is accrued the year that the leave begins. So if someone goes on mat leave, and it would never happen, but theoretically, if they want a mat leave on June 15th, the whole mat leave is accrued on the current school year. You can go to the next one. So here is what we're proposing for a budget for next year. We're going to take full advantage of the cap of 2% for local taxation, and that is what we expect to put forth to our local municipalities. No cuts to staffing, classroom, or programs, which is a huge relief. I can tell you that one that pained the board greatly. There was all of the programs and all the things that we've had to cut and reduce have been challenging and painful, whether it was WE Day or the grade 6 outdoor education program or participation in Career Trek. But a significant one that we cut last year was our high school vocational program, and it was a big budget item with staffing and mileage and supplies. It was about $360,000. That was a tough one last year, but we haven't had to cut any programs this year. So in terms of our total budget from one year to the other, we're looking at about a $305,000 increase in expenditures, and this is offset almost 100% by our additional First Nation revenue, which I referenced already. And Darrell will give you the exact numbers, but for next year, we're projecting an extra $333,000. And I think I misspoke earlier. We have 30 students this year, and we're projecting, what's the number for next year, Darrell? For additional First Nation revenue. Okay, 330. So, yeah, it was for next year. The additional thing, and I mentioned, we're going to do one school bus, and that's in the budget already. I will say to the credit of our transportation supervisor, who's a passionate advocate for transportation, and he makes the board and division admin well aware of the state of our buses. We have an aging bus fleet, and we've looked at numbers from neighboring divisions and divisions of comparable sizes. I say it with no pride. Our fleet is among the oldest, if not one of the oldest fleets in the province in terms of the average age of our fleets. And the additional thing I will say is lots of our buses have lots of kilometers on them. The one challenge has been in previous years with reductions in funding and no money for anything extra, our bus replacement plan has suffered. And last year we added a bus in the budget, and we're doing another bus this year. Now this year we have some additional revenue for First Nation, but a lot of that additional revenue is just being used to pay for things that we must pay for, like additional staffing costs. When I show you the slide that shows what our proposed additions are for next year, there's not much new, but there are some neat things that we're excited by. But we didn't have a lot of money to add. But again, the positive thing in the current budget is we're not cutting anything currently in our proposed budget. So the next two slides, if any of you looked at the handout that was distributed on Friday, it kind of showed an overview of what we're proposing for next year, and there was 2 columns. These 2 slides are just representative of those 2 columns. So the key things that we're talking about in terms of additional pressures and expenditures, and just to give you a quick definition, pressures are things that would be indisputable. We have to pay for those increasing staff costs. We have to pay for increased insurance costs, those kind of things. And expenditures would be things that could be deemed to be discretionary, but at the end of the evening on Thursday of last week, those were the things that the board chose to spend their additional money on, or our additional money. So you see the revenue that's generated from, the cost of the reductions from the province totaling $242,000. Salary and benefit costs increased by $224,000. The Numeracy Achievement Program is something that we've been looking at a couple of years, but we've never had the ability to get involved in it. And in contemplating where we may spend, or where we could spend the little bit of extra money in a total $24 million budget, and where we might get the biggest bang for a buck, the board, by consensus and passionately, wanted to reinvest it in the classroom. So given that literacy and numeracy are priorities much like any other division in Manitoba, we looked at this program, and our curriculum coordinator, Connie Zimmer, spoke to it very eloquently in an address to the board that we looked at last Thursday. And this is an intensive professional development opportunity for teachers that in a very short time in Manitoba, in 2 years, it showed dramatic increase in student achievement in numeracy. I may have said literacy, but I meant to say numeracy. So what we're proposing for next year is that all grade 4 or 5 teachers in our division are part of this intensive PD. And what that would mean is for 4 days, either in Winnipeg, or we're hoping in Brandon, given that there's lots of teachers and divisions involved from Western Manitoba, we're hoping that over that time period, and it's actually a 2-year commitment for the full pilot, that the teachers will access mentors, national experts on numeracy, and they will look at what they can do, proven things that can be done to improve numeracy achievement in our students that they're seeing in other divisions in Manitoba and they're seeing across Canada. And the one additional thing to note is currently we have 1 teacher and 1 principal from our division involved, and that just gave us an opportunity to check out the program this year to see if it was worth it, and they're raving about it, as is our curriculum coordinator. And in our proposed budget, we're suggesting that we train all our grade 4 or 5 teachers. This is a high budget estimate, but when we budget, we try to be conservative. So certainly if the training is in Brandon, the cost will shrink dramatically because there's no mileage or not as extensive mileage, less need for accommodations, those kind of things. But the board is certainly excited by this in terms of where they may spend a little bit of money to get a huge amount of bang for their buck. And theoretically, if we focus on 1 grade level or 2, as we're doing with grade 4 and grade 5, it has the potential to impact all the students in our division who eventually will move through grade 4 and 5. And there's some other additions. Increased transportation costs, $26,500. This covers a bunch of different areas in the operation budget, from increased fuel costs to other things that are needed for transportation. Now later you're going to see a slide from our Secretary-Treasurer that shows the total investment this year in transportation compared to next year. There's not a significant change, but there's still this investment, additional investment. What you will explain, Darrell, I'm sorry for taking your explanation away from you, but there's staffing reductions in other areas that we find efficiency. So that often happens in our budget. If we have savings in some areas, we reinvest them in areas that they're needed. We have a divisional person, an ICT teacher leader that works in schools full-time, just driving around the division, spending full days working with teachers and students on technology, whether it be training teachers or working with students on projects. And that position was 0.5 budgeted this year. We actually found a way to increase it to 0.75 using some different budgets and other efficiencies, but that position will be budgeted in our draft proposal for 0.75. There's some other costs for converting to Windows 10, $10,000. Here, the next line, regrettably, but I think importantly, is the only addition from the things that we've reduced over the previous 3 years. So we had $6,000 in total for recognition events. These are both for end-of-the-year recognition events for staff that are retiring, and also for our student citizenship program and the banquet that's associated with it. And I see the screen went out, but I'll just keep talking about that quickly till it comes back on. The board chose to put that back in this year. So of all the things that you will see in the 5 pages that were reduced, Unfortunately, that's the only addition that we can make, because even though we have increased First Nation revenue that I've referenced already, there's lots of additional costs, so we have to offset those with that revenue. And then insurance costs. So let's go to the next slide. So additional revenues and savings. Many of these I referenced already, so I'm not going to go into much detail. We do expect to ask our local ratepayers for an additional 2%. We know that some of the assessments have changed, and we apologize for the impact on farmers and business people and residential home assessments. We understand there's an impact, but that's the cost of doing business, and the local levy is an important source of revenue for any school division. Increase in tuition from First Nations, so that's the $330,000 I've referenced already. And there's some other lines that I'll explain briefly just so you don't have any questions about them. We're going to get a new phone contract for our land-based phones, landlines, through Westman Communications. And then there's also a new contract or program through Bell MTS for the Manitoba government employees, of which we're grouped. And we're going to find efficiencies totaling $18,000 in those areas. And there's some other budget areas that we're going to reduce. $5,000 superintendent allocation. This budget used to be $16,500 about 3 or 4 years ago, and it was just a flex fund for the superintendent and then the assistant superintendent if they wanted to support any programs or things in schools that might be a little unique. 2 years ago, we reduced that to $5,000, and for next year, we're removing it completely. And you know the way these things work. Not everything is dollar for dollar, but that kind of reduction allows for us to add a $5,000 or $6,000 item on the other side. The apprenticeship coordinator reduced by 8%, or apprenticeship coordinator, a fantastic staff member who works half-time for us and half-time for Mountain View School Division. She's asked to go to 11/12 again next year as she does this current school year, so that will save us some money. And reduced audit. We don't have to do a provincial budget audit on March 31st, so we save some money there. And a slight reduction in some resources for one of our 2 colony schools, the colony school at Decker, and that's to align the way we support both colony schools at a consistent level, Decker and Monarch. And that's an overview of our proposed changes to our budget. And now I can take a breath. I'm going to go over and start moving the slides for Secretary Treasurer, so I just want to introduce Darrell Fulton, our Secretary Treasurer, to take you through the next slides.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for coming. So these 2 pie charts just show the breakdown of how we spend our budget. And again, as Stephen mentioned, we're talking about the Fund 1 or the Park West side of the budget, about $24 million. So the pie chart on the right shows we spend over 3/4 of our budget on salaries and benefits, 78% there, 19% on services and supplies, and then 3% on fiscal items, payroll tax mostly, interest costs, and then capital and reserve. So that's where our school bus will be included in there. And then the pie chart on the right, or left, sorry, is the expenditures by function. So we spend about 59% of our budget on regular instruction, 13% on student support services. It says 4% here on divisional admin. The reason that number is 4% here is because we're talking about Park West's administration on the $24 million budget. When that same amount gets spread over the $29 million budget, when we include Wayway, then that percentage drops. And it's the overall budget that we present to the province. So you may hear Stephen talking about the 3.38% that we're required to be under the admin cap, and we are well under that as a result of sharing some administrative costs with Wayway, our education partner. Curriculum, library, and PD, we spend 2% of our budget there, 8% on transportation, 11% on the maintenance of our schools. That includes custodians in there. And then the same 3% is shown in the graph on the right. This is just further breakdown for those who are interested in the details, like the actual numbers behind the previous chart. But as you can see, we're going to be increasing our total expenditures in 2020/21 by about $305,000. That's the proposed budget. So pretty modest increase, 1.3%. So same bottom line here, just broken down a different way. So this slide shows by function where we're spending that money. And if you look to the transportation line, that's what Stephen was mentioning before, just about $1,000 increase. When you consider the salary costs that make up part of the transportation budget, we saw some savings there, but we did need to make an investment of about $26,000 on the goods and services side, mostly for fuel. Okay, now we'll flip to the revenue side of our budget. Comes to the same 24 million. We're presenting a balanced budget. The graph on the bottom just shows a breakdown. As Stephen mentioned before, we get about 54% of our funding from the province, 35% municipally, and 11% of our Fund 1 budget from First Nations. When Stephen mentioned 25% before, he was speaking of our larger budget, which includes Wayway Community School, the 29 million. Okay, so now I'll just spend a few minutes talking about the local levy. This has a few different names. There's the reason for the distinction is the special requirement is based on our fiscal year end, which runs July 1st to June 30th. And this is the amount that the province is requiring that we limit to a 2% increase, and has done for the last 3 years. And the special levy is the tax, it's the same type of thing, except we're talking a calendar year basis here. So because of the difference in our fiscal year versus calendar year, we have to do a few calculations to come up with the special levy. Okay, so this slide shows the 2% increase. So we're going from 10.7 million in the current year, adding 2% to get to 10.9 million. That's our special requirement. Can go to the next slide, please, Stephen. And then if you start from the right side here, we take roughly 56% of the 2019-20 special requirement, add that to 44% of the 2021 special requirement to come up with a 2020 special levy. So that's the calendar year special levy, 10.8 million. We start this slide with that same 10.8 million, make a couple of adjustments. 322,000 is what we owe to the Francophone division in Manitoba because we have one of the DSFM schools within our footprint. We reduce it by the tax incentive grant from the province to get the total special levy of 10.3 million. Okay, so this slide just shows for those who are interested in really understanding how their school taxes are calculated. This is the slide you need and the formula that you need. There's differences depending on the type of property that you own. So as you can see, residential property is taxed at 45% of the assessed value. And 2020 is a reassessment year. It happens every other year, every even year. So overall, we're seeing about a 9% increase in assessment values in 2020 compared to 2019. The highest being in farmland there, almost 13%. Okay, so I do get some questions from time to time about the mill rate. Sometimes people ask what's happening to the mills. So mills are actually going down from 10.5 in 2019 to 9.9 in 2020. The reason for this is the denominator is getting bigger, so that's the big $1 billion amount that you see there. Just a result of increased assessment values. Yep. So this slide just shows the breakdown of the $10.3 million special levy by the different property types. So you can see in 2020 that 10.3 million, about half of that is coming from farmland owners. About 3 million of it is coming from residential landowners, and about 2 million is coming from other or commercial landowners. Then I've got some examples at the bottom there explaining that if your house was assessed at $153,000, almost $154,000 in 2019, and then when we apply the average reassessment values, this will vary from house to house depending on what your property was assessed at. So I've just used the average percentage. Then you will pay 0 school taxes in 2020 because of the $700 rebate. Now there were some changes this year to that $700 rebate. You probably got the same letter that I did from your municipality. So what the province has done is they've noted that that $700 rebate was being first applied to school taxes, and then if there was any left over, it was being applied next to your local taxes, and they've eliminated the ability now to use any leftover for your municipal taxes. So if your house was valued at less than $153,000 and you get a rebate of say $600, then that's all the rebates you're going to get. You can't use that extra $100 to lower your municipal taxes anymore. So yeah, here I just run through a couple of examples, just showing the 2020 assessment increase and the effect that has on what the 2019 assessed value of your property may have been. In these examples, I'm using $200,000 for farmland, also $200,000 for commercial property. So yeah, calculations are there. Multiply it by the mill rate, divide by 1,000 to get what your special levy will be. Then there's different rebates. Like I said, $700 for residential property owners. 80%, you get an 80% rebate on your farmland taxes, up to a maximum of $5,000. This is one of our last slides. Just shows the history of our special levy. So I'll just point out the numbers on the right there. We had some low years around the global recession there. Maybe still feeling the effects of BSE, although I think that was back in 2003. I know the board of the day, though, did try to keep taxes low for our farmers back then. Then we saw some increases. Highest amount there was 6.9% in 2017, and since then the percentage increase has been quite low as a result of the restrictions placed on us by the province. Yeah, the reason it's 2.3 there, it goes, if you want to flip back to a couple other slides there, Stephen, you'll see that 10.3. There we go. So it's the reason that I mentioned before, just the difference between the special requirement and the special levy. Special requirement is based on our fiscal year end. And then there's a couple of other adjustments, like I mentioned, that get us to the special levy, which is based on the calendar year end. So even though it says 2.3% there, we are compliant because it's a special requirement that has to be within 2%. Next steps, you want to do this part?
So, thank you, Darrell. The budget process happens very quickly. Even though we start pre-planning in early December, we aren't certain about what's coming until we get the provincial budget announcement. This year, we anticipated the additional 2% reduction. We thought, and we were correct, that there was another cap on local taxation. We didn't know about the management reduction until they announced it. But we were able to start doing preliminary budgeting and start thinking about what it might look like for next year. But the process is really quick. So January 30th, we got the funding announcement. We've met several times as a board, evening meetings in the last 3 weeks. And here we are on February 24th, knowing that by March 15th, we have to tell the municipalities what the taxation rate will be. We're quite confident that it's going to be the 2%. And then by the end of March, we have to submit our detailed budget to the province. So in terms of what we have scheduled between now and the end of March, actually March 13th for municipalities, we have a meeting next week, or in 2 weeks, on March 5th. No, it actually is next Thursday. And it's a regular board meeting, but there's also an opportunity for presentations and delegations. So let me explain the process. If anyone, whether you're watching tonight or you see the budget online or you view this, and I should have mentioned at the beginning, I think we're going to archive this for anyone that wants to look at it at your leisure. It's an exciting thing for grade 7 and 8 kids to do, to learn about budgeting. No, I wouldn't recommend it, but it's really important stuff. But if on March 5th anyone is interested in coming to make a presentation, they could do it. So if there is something that we're reducing that people aren't happy with, they can come and tell us. If public ratepayers or staff, students want to come and tell us that we need to invest more money in another area, we're open to that. So that would happen next Thursday, March 5th. If we get no public presentations, we will have time that evening, and it may be the case that we approve our final budget on March 5th, but any public presentations or any need for future discussion, We probably have about another 8 days after that, and maybe even up till the end of March if we really need it, to make final decisions about what our budget might look like. There are more things that the board wants to talk about. There are other things that we want to hear from stakeholders. So if you don't want to make a presentation, another option you might have is just email us at the division. Tell us, have you thought about this, or why aren't you spending money here, or could you use that money somewhere else? It's important to note that there's lots of things that aren't in this proposed budget that people requested. So each year we have our schools and school staff, often through the principal, we ask them to make suggestions for a budget for next year. We have all our department heads ask for things. So there were several things that we said no to this year, and many of them were in the area of infrastructure. So even though I didn't reference these directly, I think it's important to note now that back to the uncertainty about the the education review, the provincial education review, we chose not to invest significantly in infrastructure. So a couple of practical examples. Our transportation supervisor told us that we need 3 more buses to get back on a replacement plan. Regrettably, we chose to only put 1 in the budget. And there were things in the maintenance budget that were requested, such as a replacement truck, a used truck for replacement, because one of our trucks for maintenance staff is getting long in the tooth, and some money for a roof replacement at the maintenance shed. We are hoping, as many people across Manitoba are, the changes that come with the education review, again, I apologize, aren't that significant. But imagining that there's a possibility that there may be school division amalgamations, we're reluctant to invest in infrastructure that may not be required infrastructure in 2 years. So to the detriment of some of the budgets in our division, we've chose to reinvest any additional revenue or savings that we might have in school-based programs or staffing, and that's been to the detriment of some of the infrastructure. Hopefully we'll get some direction from the province on March 27th, and we'll know what the future holds, and then we can start planning a little more with more intent for infrastructure sustainability. So that's it. So lots to digest, and as I mentioned earlier, the PowerPoint presentation is together with this video, which will be recorded, will be on our division website tomorrow sometime in the morning, so feel free to check that out. But we do have some people here in the audience, and if anyone has a question, feel free to ask it. And I guess the additional thing I can note is if anyone's watching on YouTube right now, if you're logged in, you could ask a question as well. But I may just check with our technician and ask, is there anyone logged in on YouTube? All right. Okay. And before I say good night, because there's going to be an opportunity for questions, I should mention Jason Kelly, who you can't see, he's off to my right. He's one of our divisional ICT people. And Jason was here, I think, about 5:30 today, setting up the cameras and the sound so this could be live streamed. So thank you very much, Jason. Do you have any questions? If we do, we're going to use a mic just so the people that are listening at home and for recording purposes will hear you. Gerald, do you want to help with this? All right, so we do have a question. As soon as microphone is on, we'll turn it over to Adam Grabowski.
Test.
So I know that your discussions have included with the 15% for admin, and that you're hoping the government is going to allow what you have already proposed. Have you discussed what happens if the government says no, you have to do it further?
If the government says no, we're not planning to spend that money. So if it's $100,000 we save, if we're forced to make a reduction, despite the fact that we are fairly certain that we don't need to do that, we would likely just put the money in surplus. Because the things that are on hold right now with our current budget are bus purchases, maintenance-related things. And then we would have an opportunity to reinvest in those after March 27th. The interesting thing, when Darrell and I had a conversation with someone at the Department of Education last week by telephone, they said that while this management reduction is not tied directly to the education review, we may not find out the outcome of the management reduction and direction until after the education review is made public. So you can surmise what you want from that, I guess. Other questions? You can just say what she said.
Thanks, Tanya. Tanya was noting that if anyone would like to come and meet with the board, please register your intent to do so with Jody by this Friday. And today would be great.
So Jody is the executive assistant in the division office. So yeah, you just phone the division office and state, or if you know the email address, which is on our webpage, just say, I would like to come on Thursday, March 5th and speak about this item related to the potential budget for next year. We have a question in the middle. Just because we don't have we do have a camera on you, but if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself by name so the people watching from afar know who is asking the question.
Tanis Chesley asking the question. Just given that we don't know what's going to happen with the education review yet, is there a specific reason why we're putting or we're keeping over about $400,000 in operating surplus? Wouldn't it be better, especially considering there could be amalgamations or stuff like that, to spend that money on our students before it gets bundled up?
That's a good question. So what I can tell you, just to reframe the question, if we're projecting $400,000 surplus at the end of the year, why would we not reinvest it on those students right now? So I guess two things to respond to that. Whatever configuration this division has in the future, our students are going to still be in it. So whether we spend it now or invest in the students in the future, you can make an argument that it's spread more thinly if we were amalgamated with another division or two. And I don't want to make this about potential amalgamation, but everyone that's waiting for the review thinks that's a possibility. But the additional thing I would say, two things. Firstly, the province allows up to 4%. And this would only give us 2% at the end of the year. And we're just coming off a year where we started with 0% surplus. So surplus is important. And the additional thing I'll note is we wouldn't have this surplus if it wasn't for the single billing. And we wouldn't have this surplus if maternity leaves weren't within our budget. But we also have to wait to see what happens over the course of the year. Because our hope is that we have $400,000 at the end of the year. But 2 more maternity leaves could be a big hit. I've used the phrase, if we get snowmageddon again, a big snowstorm that really taxes snow removal budgets and those kind of things. We have 2 buses that lose engines and need replacement. So 400,000 is a conservative estimate, and our fingers are crossed, but that assumes all budgets are spent and not overspent, and we need to allow that cushion in case anything happens between March 31st and the end of June. Certainly, it would be our intent not to spend the whole surplus before anything happens with the special education review, but if we do realize that surplus, then we would hit areas that we haven't been able to support in this budget. We need more buses. So we need more buses, we're only putting 1 in. Budgeting is tough. We're trying to prioritize where to spend and where to reduce, and there's a limited source of money. So when the board's contemplating 1 more school bus, if you recall that slide that showed the things that we're investing in, we can't cut staffing costs. It would just basically mean that everything we're proposing that we're adding, we couldn't add. And even all that together wouldn't buy us another bus. So part of the reason that we're keeping the surplus is to allow us to do those things that we've deferred. So when we followed up with our maintenance supervisor and our transportation supervisor, and even our ICT supervisor who would like a device replacement plan for the school division, we have to tell them no because we can't spend that money now. We need to see what happens. But good question. But we also don't want to put ourselves in a situation where we're in a deficit for unanticipated expenditures. Is that okay? Whether you agree or not, that's the best I can tell you. Any other questions?
We do have a question online, Stephen.
Okay.
It says, are there any plans to address the recent rash of online bullying? Then a couple of schools are mentioned having some major issues right now. Will the budget have an impact on a service like this?
That's a good question. I would say that, like any other school division, unfortunately, in North America, we have challenges with inappropriate use of social media. Whether that inappropriate use happens at the school level or it happens in the evening or on the weekends, and it has a reciprocal impact when kids return to school. So there's tremendous benefits and advantages to internet connectivity and social media, but sometimes those platforms are used for negative purposes. So I wouldn't say routinely, but a couple times a year we have instances where we're supporting schools because of a small group of kids or a large group of kids that are doing things that they shouldn't be on social media. I don't think it necessarily requires an investment, a financial investment, but it requires that teachers are trained and students are aware of the challenges and that we're working together to minimize them. So we've had in our schools, almost every school in our division has had multiple presentations on internet safety and appropriate use of the internet and digital citizenship. And those things are themes within our classes as well. But there are times that we have challenges. And when we have those challenges, we deal with them seriously. We try to support any students or any individuals that are victimized by online bullying. And we react quickly and we seek additional support when we have to deal with it. So to give you a practical example, increasingly if we have issues with online bullying, we contact the RCMP. Sometimes there's things that we can't do. We can't find out who started this post or started this website or started this blog or started this thing on Instagram. But the RCMP can. So when those things happen, we talk to our local detachment, and often we will do follow-up assemblies in schools to talk about what happened and reassure kids that it's inappropriate and tell anyone that needs support to come and see us. But often when the principal's talking, there's someone in an RCMP office or a uniform beside them just to reaffirm the fact that not only is this inappropriate, but in many cases this is illegal. So we're absolutely committed to reducing online bullying, just like we are with all bullying. Unfortunately, we recognize that it's difficult to make that a situation where it isn't happening, but we try to be proactive to give students and staff and parents skills to combat it. And certainly when anyone tells us or makes us aware of that stuff, we respond quickly. So I don't think it's a budget item, and I took a few minutes to talk about it because it's something that it's definitely challenging for any school division, and we're no different than other school divisions. Nothing else online. All right. If no one objects, I'm going to thank you for your time. For anyone that's connected from home and anyone that watches this later, again, just to reaffirm our commitment to engage with you as the public, and it need not be limited to what's happening in real time right now. If you have questions, email the school division, phone the school division. It'll be next Thursday before we get together again as a board to talk about what our final budget might look like, and certainly, as Darrell stated before, and you're welcome to come and make a presentation about any aspect of education in our school division. Certainly anything that relates to financial expenditures, whether it be savings or things that we might consider for next year. So I want to thank you for your time tonight. Thank you for your ongoing support in our communities and in our schools. And until next year, I guess, the next time we connect online, have a safe night. Bye.